brought this on yourself, you worthless little wretch." The words hit harder than the iron shackles that bound her wrists to the stone wall. Lyanna felt them settle deep in her chest, where all the other cruel declarations had made their home over the years. The guard's laughter echoed through the beast stalls as he turned away, leaving her alone in the suffocating darkness. She had known this moment would come. The second she had spoken up during the Alpha King's mating ceremony negotiations, the second she had dared suggest that perhaps the kingdom's needs mattered more than political alliances, she had signed her own death warrant. Seraphina's faction had moved swiftly, twisting her words into treason, her concern into disrespect. The chains were heavy, but they were nothing compared to the weight of knowing how quickly she had fallen from invisible to hunted. For 23 years she had survived by being no one, by blending into the background until even she forgot she existed. But one moment of speaking truth to power, and now she was here. The beast stalls stretched out before her in the flickering torchlight, a labyrinth of reinforced cages and iron barriers designed to contain the kingdom's most dangerous supernatural creatures. This was where they brought the werewolves when their bloodlust became too much for even the pack to handle. This was where the shadow cats prowled when the moon made them too wild for human contact. This was where ancient spirits waited, creatures so old and powerful that even the Alpha King approached them with caution. And now this was where they had chained her to die. "She'll be lucky to last until dawn," one guard had whispered to another as they locked her shackles. "The beasts can smell fear. They'll tear her apart the moment the sun sets." The sun was setting now. She could feel it in her bones, that familiar ache that came with nightfall, though down here in the depths of the compound she couldn't see the sky. The creatures were stirring. She could hear them moving in their enclosures, the scrape of claws on stone, the soft padding of massive paws, the rustle of wings that blocked out what little light filtered down from above. Something was different tonight. She had spent enough time in the shadows to recognize when the world was shifting around her, and there was an electricity in the air that made her skin prickle with anticipation. The beasts were restless, but not in the way she had expected. Their movements weren't aggressive. They were curious. A low growl rumbled from somewhere in the darkness ahead of her, and Lyanna pressed her back against the stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the shadows. She had heard stories about Fenris, the massive werewolf who had been brought here after he had killed 3 enemy soldiers with his bare hands in his human form, then shifted and torn apart an entire squadron. They said his wolf was the size of a small horse, with silver eyes that could see straight through to your soul. They said he answered to no one, not even the Alpha King himself. The darkness shifted, and she saw those silver eyes first, gleaming in the torchlight like molten metal. Then the rest of him emerged from the shadows, and she understood why grown warriors crossed themselves when they spoke his name. He was enormous, his black fur so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him, his massive frame radiating power and barely leashed violence. But he wasn't attacking. He was studying her. Fenris approached slowly, his great head tilted to one side as if listening to something she couldn't hear. When he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, he lowered himself to the ground and settled beside her, positioning his massive form between her and the rest of the stalls like a living shield. She stared at him in shock, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. Werewolves didn't protect. They destroyed. They killed. They certainly didn't lie down beside helpless prisoners and offer themselves as guardians. But that's exactly what Fenris was doing. The other creatures had noticed. She could hear them moving, emerging from their own enclosures, drawn by something she couldn't understand. Shadow cats materialized from the darkness, their sleek forms moving with liquid grace as they formed a loose circle around her. Their eyes glowed like amber lanterns in the dim light, fixed on her face with an intensity that should have been terrifying. Instead, she felt safe for the first time in years. The largest shadow cat, a female with silver markings along her spine, crept closer and settled at Leanna's feet, her warm body a comfort against the cold stone. Others followed, creating a living barrier of fur and fang that no human enemy could hope to penetrate. From the deepest part of the stalls came a sound that made even Fenris lift his great head in acknowledgement. It was a rumble so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself, the kind of sound that spoke of age beyond measure and power beyond comprehension. The ancient bear spirit was awakening. Leanna had never seen him, but every person in the kingdom knew the stories. He had been here when the compound was built, older than memory, older than the royal bloodline itself. The Alpha Kings of generations past had made pacts with him, agreements that kept the peace between the human world and the wild places beyond their borders. He slept most of the time now, but when he woke, even the bravest warriors trembled. The bear spirit emerged from the shadows like a mountain coming to life. His fur was silver-white with age, his massive frame scarred from countless battles, his eyes the deep brown of rich earth and ancient wisdom. He should have been terrifying. Instead, when his gaze fell on her, she felt something she had never experienced before. She felt recognized. He approached her slowly, each step deliberate and careful, until he was close enough that she could see her reflection in his eyes. For a long moment they simply stared at each other, and she had the strangest feeling that he was seeing straight through to her soul, reading secrets that she didn't even know she carried. Then he lowered his great head in what could only be described as a bow. The other creatures followed suit. Fenris dipped his muzzle toward the ground. The shadow cats pressed their bodies low in submission. Even the smaller creatures, the ones she couldn't see clearly in the darkness, rustled with movement that spoke of acknowledgement, of respect. They were bowing to her, the worthless girl who had been chained here to die. Something stirred deep in her chest, a warmth that spread through her veins like liquid fire. For a moment she could have sworn she felt another presence in her mind, wild and fierce and utterly untamed. Her wolf, the part of herself she had always known, was broken, damaged, too weak to ever emerge. But maybe it wasn't broken. Maybe it had just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. The ancient bear spirit lifted his head and fixed her with that knowing stare, and she heard a voice in her mind, ancient and patient and filled with a sadness that spanned centuries. "Welcome home, little queen. We have been waiting for you for such a very long time." The words should have been impossible. Bears didn't speak telepathically. Ancient spirits were myths, legends, stories told to frighten children. But as she sat there surrounded by creatures who should have torn her apart, feeling more at peace than she had in her entire life, she began to wonder if everything she had been told about herself, about the world, about what was possible, had been a lie. Outside, dawn was still hours away. But something was awakening in the darkness of the beast stalls, something that would change everything she thought she knew about who she was and what she was meant to become. 3 months had passed since Seraphina's exile, and the kingdom had settled into a rhythm unlike anything in recorded history. Leanna stood on the great balcony that overlooked the transformed palace grounds, her hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her belly as she watched shadow cats playing with human children in the gardens below. The changes had been gradual but profound. Where once the beast stalls had housed dangerous creatures in iron cages, now there were comfortable dens and open spaces where supernatural beings could rest between their duties as the kingdom's protectors. War-wolves patrolled the borders alongside human guards, their enhanced senses detecting threats that conventional patrols would miss. Shadow cats served as messengers, carrying important communications across vast distances with speed that no horse could match. But it was the sanctuary she had established in the eastern forests that represented the true transformation of her reign. Creatures that had been driven into hiding by centuries of fear and persecution were emerging from the deep woods, seeking the protection that the renewed covenants promised. Phoenix chicks whose parents had been hunted to near extinction were learning to fly under the watchful eyes of great eagles. Water spirits that hadn't been seen in generations were returning to the kingdom's rivers and lakes. "The morning reports, my queen," said Marcus, her new adviser, approaching with a scroll of correspondence from the neighbouring realms. He was a young man who had distinguished himself during the transition, one of the few nobles who had embraced the new order with genuine enthusiasm rather than political calculation. She took the scroll with a smile, noting how naturally he had adapted to working alongside her supernatural guardians. Fenris lay at her feet like a living shadow, his silver eyes constantly scanning for threats, while a shadow cat with distinctive white markings perched on the balcony railing, ready to carry messages to any part of the kingdom at a moment's notice. "King Aldwyn of the Eastern Reaches sends congratulations on your pregnancy," Marcus reported as she scanned the letters. He also requests a formal meeting to discuss establishing similar creature sanctuaries within his borders. Apparently, they've been having trouble with ice wraiths in their mountain regions. Lyanna nodded, unsurprised. Word of the kingdom's renewed prosperity had spread quickly through the neighbouring realms, along with stories of supernatural threats being handled with unprecedented efficiency. What had once been feared as a destabilising force was now being recognised as a strategic advantage that other rulers desperately wanted to replicate. "King Roderick of the Western clans is more cautious," Marcus continued. "He acknowledges your authority, but requests assurance that the creature armies will not be used for territorial expansion. He seems particularly concerned about the stories of shadow cats crossing his borders." "Shadow cats don't recognise human borders," Lyanna replied with amusement, glancing at her feline messenger, who flicked her tail in what might have been agreement. "But they also don't attack unless threatened. Perhaps King Roderick would benefit from a formal education about the difference between protection and aggression." The ancient bear spirit's mental voice rumbled through her consciousness, carrying the warm approval she had come to treasure. "The old fear runs deep in some bloodlines, little queen. They remember stories their great-grandparents told about beast queens who commanded armies, but they have forgotten that those armies were raised in defence, not conquest." Kyle emerged onto the balcony, his presence immediately causing the mate bond to pulse with warmth and contentment. He had adapted to their shared rule with the kind of natural partnership that made political observers from other kingdoms take careful notes about the advantages of supernatural alliances. "The northern patrols report unusual activity along the old border stones," he said, settling beside her with the easy intimacy of mates who had learned to share not just love, but the burdens of leadership. "Nothing threatening, but the stones themselves are beginning to glow again." Lyanna felt a surge of satisfaction at the news. The border stones were ancient markers placed by the first Beast Queen to mark the boundaries where human and supernatural territories intersected. They had been dormant for centuries, their protective enchantments fading as the bloodline disappeared. Their reactivation was another sign that the old covenants were truly being renewed. "Good," she said simply. "The stronger those protections become, the less we'll need to worry about the kind of threats that destroyed other kingdoms." A shadow cat with silver markings materialised from a patch of seemingly inadequate darkness, carrying a message tube in her mouth. She approached Lyanna with the respectful affection that had become standard among her supernatural subjects, dropping the tube at her feet before settling nearby with the kind of casual alertness that never truly relaxed. The message was from Elder Thane, who had been working with scholars from across the realm to document the return of supernatural creatures and the renewal of ancient magics. His report was filled with observations that would have been dismissed as fantasy just months ago, but were now accepted as the new reality of their transformed kingdom. "Dragon sign in the far northern peaks," Lyanna read aloud, her voice carrying wonder despite her growing familiarity with such reports. "Not aggressive, but definitely present. Elder Thane believes they're responding to the renewed covenants, possibly considering a return to the old alliances." Kyle raised an eyebrow. Dragons haven't been seen in this realm for over 500 years. Dragons have long memories, the ancient bear spirit observed, his mental voice carrying the weight of centuries. They do not return lightly, nor do they ally themselves with power they do not respect. If they are considering emergence, it is because they have decided the Beast Queen bloodline is worth their acknowledgement. As if summoned by their conversation, a great eagle landed on the balcony railing with the kind of precision that spoke of intelligence rather than instinct. When it spoke telepathically, its mental voice carried the crisp clarity of a military report. My queen, the dragon known as Astroleth, sends greetings. She has been watching the renewal of the covenants from her mountain fastness and wishes to arrange a meeting to discuss the restoration of the oldest alliances. Lyanna felt her breath catch. A dragon wanting to meet with her, to potentially renew alliances that predated human kingdoms by millennia. It was a level of recognition that no beast queen had achieved in recorded history. "Tell Astroleth," she said carefully, "that I am honoured by her attention and would welcome such a meeting. Ask her to name the time and place that would be most appropriate for a discussion between equals." The great eagle inclined its head in acknowledgement before launching itself from the railing, its powerful wings carrying it toward the northern peaks where legends were stirring to life. "Dragons," Kyle said softly, shaking his head in amazement. "Our children are going to grow up in a world where dragons are real and present." Lyanna's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where their air grew strong and healthy. According to the ancient bear spirit, the child would carry both Alpha and Beast Queen bloodlines, making them potentially the most powerful supernatural ruler in the realm's history. "They're going to grow up in a world where they never have to hide what they are," she corrected gently, "where their power is celebrated rather than feared, where they can form alliances with beings we're only now rediscovering." Around them, the kingdom continued its transformation. In the gardens below, human children were learning to communicate with creature playmates, developing the kind of natural bonds that would make them ideal bridge builders in the years ahead. The Royal Council now included representatives from various supernatural communities, their perspectives adding depth and wisdom to decisions that affected all citizens, not just the human ones. Trade was flourishing as well, with merchants from neighbouring realms paying premium prices for goods that were enhanced or protected by supernatural abilities. Textiles woven by shadow cats possessed properties that no human craft could replicate. Weapons forged in the presence of fire sprites held their edge indefinitely. Crops grown in soil blessed by earth elementals produced harvests that could feed twice the normal population. But perhaps most importantly, the kingdom had become a refuge for those who needed protection. Persecuted shifters from distant realms found safety within their borders. Magical creatures driven from their ancestral territories by expanding human settlements discovered sanctuary in the protected forests. Even humans fleeing political oppression or supernatural threats were welcomed, as long as they showed respect for the laws that governed both species. "You have built something unprecedented, little queen," the ancient bear spirit observed, his mental voice warm with pride. "A realm where power serves protection rather than domination, where differences are celebrated rather than feared." The first Beast Queen would be proud of what her bloodline has accomplished. As the sun began to set over the kingdom, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Lyanna felt a deep satisfaction settle in her bones. The broken girl who had been chained in the beast stalls was gone, replaced by a woman who had found her true purpose and the strength to fulfill it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to build on the foundation they had established. There would be diplomatic negotiations with dragon representatives, strategic planning with creature allies, and the constant work of balancing the needs of multiple species within a single realm. But tonight she was content to stand on her balcony with her mate at her side, watching over a kingdom where the impossible had become routine and where love had proven stronger than fear. The Beast Queen had returned, and the world was better for it. The final months of pregnancy had been unlike anything the kingdom's healers had ever witnessed. Lyanna's body carried not just one extraordinary child, but a being whose very presence seemed to pulse with supernatural energy that grew stronger with each passing day. The ancient bear spirit had taken to spending most of his time near the royal chambers, his protective instincts heightened by what he sensed growing within her. "The child dreams," he told her one evening, as she sat in the nursery they had prepared, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I can feel the stirring of consciousness that spans both human and beast. This one will bridge worlds in ways we cannot yet imagine." Lyanna felt the truth of his words in the way creatures throughout the kingdom responded to her pregnancy. Werewolves that had never shown interest in human affairs now patrolled the palace corridors with devoted attention. Shadow cats brought her gifts of rare flowers and polished stones, their feline minds somehow understanding that she carried someone precious. Even the great eagles, those most independent of supernatural beings, had taken to circling the palace in protective formations. The rebuilt beast stalls had become a place of pilgrimage for her now, a reminder of how far she had travelled from the girl who had been chained there in despair. The comfortable dens that housed the kingdom's creature guardians were a far cry from the iron cages of the old system, but it was the memorial wall that drew her attention most frequently. She had commissioned it after the kingdom's transformation was complete, a stone monument that honoured every creature that had died in captivity during the dark years when the Beast Queen bloodline was lost. Their names were carved in both human script and the ancient runic language that predated the kingdom's founding, ensuring that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. "They would have loved to see this day," she murmured, running her fingers over the carved stone as Kyle settled beside her on the bench they had placed before the memorial. All those generations of creatures who lived and died without knowing their queen would return. "They knew," Kyle said gently, his hand covering hers where it rested on her belly. Maybe not consciously, but somewhere in their deepest instincts, they knew the bloodline would endure. That's what kept them hoping, kept them loyal even when they had no reason to believe things would change. A flutter of movement beneath her skin made them both pause, and Lyanna felt her breath catch as tiny hands or paws pressed against her palm from within. The baby was responding to their conversation, to the emotions flowing through the mate bond, to the presence of the memorial and what it represented. The young shifters who had arrived at the kingdom in recent weeks were perhaps the clearest sign of how completely the world had changed. Children who had been hidden away by fearful parents, taught to suppress their abilities and deny their nature, now ran freely through the palace grounds alongside their creature friends. They were learning to shift not as something shameful to be concealed, but as a gift to be celebrated and properly controlled. "Aunt Lyanna," called Sarah, a 7-year-old wolf shifter whose parents had brought her from the distant mountain clans. "Watch me!" The child shifted with the fluid grace of someone who had never been taught that her nature was wrong, her small wolf form bounding across the courtyard with pure joy. The adult wolves who served as palace guardians watched her with the kind of indulgent affection usually reserved for pack pups, ready to intervene if play became too rough, but content to let her explore her abilities without fear. "Beautiful," Lyanna said, applauding as Sarah shifted back to human form with a delighted giggle. "Your control is getting better every day." It was these moments that reminded her why all the political struggles and supernatural challenges had been worthwhile. These children would never know the shame and fear that had defined her own childhood. They would grow up understanding that their dual nature was a blessing, not a curse, and they would help build a future where that understanding spread to every corner of the world. The ancient ceremonies that had been revived during her reign were another source of deep satisfaction. The seasonal celebrations that honoured the balance between human and creature communities had drawn participants from across the known world. Diplomats who came expecting political theatre found themselves witnessing genuine spiritual communion between species. You have given them back their heritage, the ancient bear spirit observed as they watched the evening ceremony from the nursery window. Below them, human and creature voices joined in harmony, singing songs that had been silent for centuries. Not just the creatures, but the humans as well. They are remembering what their ancestors knew about the beauty of connection across species. The baby kicked vigorously at the sound of the singing, and Lyanna smiled as she felt the responding pulse of joy from creatures throughout the palace. Her child was already forming bonds with the supernatural community, already becoming the bridge between worlds that their bloodline was meant to represent. "The dragon delegation arrives tomorrow," Cale mentioned, his voice carrying a mixture of anticipation and careful diplomacy. "Astroleth has agreed to attend the birth ceremony, assuming our timing works out correctly." The prospect of having a dragon present for her child's birth should have been terrifying. Instead, Lyanna felt honoured. Dragons were notoriously selective about which events merited their attention, and Astroleth's willingness to participate was a recognition of her child's potential importance to the supernatural world. Final preparations for the birth had taken on ceremonial significance that went far beyond normal royal protocol. The nursery itself had been blessed by representatives from every supernatural community in the kingdom. Werewolves had contributed fur from their own coats to line the cradle. Shadow cats had woven protective charms into tapestries that would hang on the walls. Even the great eagles had provided feathers that were said to grant the gift of far sight to children who slept beneath them. But it was the ancient bear spirit's contribution that touched her most deeply. He had spent weeks working with the kingdom's craftsmen to create a mobile that would hang above the baby's crib, carved with figures representing every creature that had served the Beast Queen bloodline throughout history. It was a family tree of sorts, a reminder that this child would be born into a legacy of connection and protection that spanned millennia. "The bloodline continues," he said, as they examined the finished mobile together, his mental voice carrying satisfaction that seemed to ease burdens he had carried for centuries. But more than that, it evolves. This child will have opportunities that no previous Beast Queen ever possessed. Alliance with dragons, friendship with species that were lost to us for generations, and the support of human communities that truly understand the value of supernatural protection. As they prepared for sleep that night, as Cale's protective presence settled around her like a warm blanket, and the creatures that guarded their chambers took their positions, Lyanna felt a profound sense of completion. The scared girl who had been chained in the beast stalls, who had believed herself worthless and broken, had become a woman who could offer safety and hope to others who felt lost and afraid. Tomorrow might bring the birth of her child, or it might be another day of waiting and preparation. But either way, she was ready. Ready to welcome a new generation into a world where love was stronger than fear, where differences were celebrated rather than persecuted, where the bonds between human and beast had been renewed for all time. The ancient bear spirit's final thought drifted through her consciousness as she drifted towards sleep, carrying the blessing of ages past and the promise of ages yet to come. Sleep well, little queen. Dream of the future you have built for the child who will carry forward everything you have accomplished. The bloodline lives, the covenants endure, and the world is better for what you have given it. Asterisk. The birth came with the dawn, as if her son had chosen to enter the world with the light that would guide his reign. Lyanna felt the first true contraction as the eastern sky began to blush with pink and gold, and by the time the sun crested the horizon, she was holding the most extraordinary child the kingdom had ever seen. He shifted within moments of drawing his first breath. The tiny wolf cub that nestled against her chest bore fur of pure silver, but it was the markings that made every creature present fall silent with awe. Ancient symbols spiraled across his coat in patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid moonlight, runes that spoke of power older than kingdoms, older than the division between human and beast. "He carries both bloodlines fully," whispered the healer, a woman whose grandmother had assisted at the birth of the last Beast Queen's children centuries ago. "I have never seen markings like these. They're not just wolf patterns, they're something entirely new." The ancient bear spirit approached the bed with steps so careful they barely disturbed the air, his massive head lowering until he could study the newborn prince with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. When he spoke telepathically, his mental voice carried reverence that bordered on worship. "Behold Elric of the Dual Crown, heir to both Alpha and Beast Queen bloodlines, bridge between worlds that have never before been united in a single being. The prophecies spoke of such a child, though we had given up hope of ever witnessing the fulfillment." As if responding to the ancient spirit's words, baby Elric shifted back to human form, his tiny fist closing around his mother's finger with surprising strength. His eyes, when they opened, held depths that seemed far older than his minutes of life, alternating between the silver of his wolf heritage and the deep green of his father's alpha lineage. Kyle settled beside them on the great bed, his expression torn between wonder and protective fieriness that made the mate bond pulse with warmth. "He's perfect," he murmured, reaching out to stroke the downy hair that crowned their son's head. "Look at him, Lyanna. He's already trying to communicate." It was true. The baby's eyes tracked the movement of creatures around the room with intelligence that went beyond normal infant awareness. When Fenris padded closer to investigate the new arrival, Aelric gurgled with what sounded remarkably like an attempt at telepathic contact. The great war-wolf's response was immediate and overwhelming. He dropped to his belly beside the bed, his silver eyes bright with tears as he felt the first tentative mental touch from his queen's heir. "My prince," Fenris said, his telepathic voice choked with emotion. "I pledge my life, my strength, my loyalty to your service. As I served your mother through her trials, so will I serve you through whatever challenges await." One by one, the other creatures present followed suit. Shadow cats materialized from corners where they had been keeping respectful vigil, approaching the bed to offer their devotion to the newborn prince. The great eagles outside the windows called their acknowledgement, their piercing cries carrying across the kingdom to spread the news that the heir had been born. But it was the arrival of Astroleth that transformed the birth chamber into something approaching the sacred. The dragon entered through the great windows, her massive form somehow managing to fit through an opening that should have been far too small for her bulk. Magic, Lyanna realized, watching in fascination as space itself seemed to bend around the ancient being to accommodate her presence. Astroleth was everything the legends claimed, and more. Her scales were the deep blue-black of midnight skies, shot through with veins of silver that caught the morning light and threw it back in patterns that made the eye water to follow. Her wings, folded carefully against her sides, still dominated the room, while her great horned head moved with the deliberate grace of something that had never doubted its own power. "Little Queen," the dragon said, her telepathic voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the merely physical. "You have accomplished something that the oldest of my kind believed impossible. You have birthed a child who carries the potential to unite not just human and beast, but all the ancient powers that once walked freely through this realm." She approached the bed with steps that made no sound despite her enormous size, her great head lowering until she could study the baby with eyes like molten gold. Aelric, showing no fear whatsoever, reached toward the dragon with tiny hands, babbling in what might have been an attempt at draconic speech. Astroleth's response was a sound like silver bells mixed with distant thunder, a dragon's laughter that filled the chamber with joy. "He knows me," she said with wonder. "This child, barely an hour old, recognizes the dragon speech and attempts to respond. The bloodlines have not just combined, they have evolved." The ceremony that followed was nothing like the formal royal presentations that had marked the births of previous heirs. Instead, It was a gathering of species that had been separate for millennia, all coming together to acknowledge a child whose very existence represented the possibility of true unity. Warwolves howled their recognition, their voices joined by the songs of shadow cats, whose purring harmonized with the deep rumble of earth spirits that had emerged from the palace foundations. Great eagles added their piercing calls to the chorus, while creatures from the deep forests contributed sounds that human ears had never heard before. At the centre of it all, baby Elric listened with the focused attention of someone receiving the most important education of his life. His eyes moved from creature to creature, taking in the faces and voices of those who would serve as his teachers, his protectors, his family in the years ahead. "He will never know the loneliness that marked your childhood, little queen," the ancient bear spirit observed, his mental voice warm with satisfaction. "This child will grow up surrounded by love from both worlds, understanding from birth that his dual nature is a gift to be celebrated rather than a burden to be hidden." As the days passed, as the initial wonder of Elric's birth settled into the routine of caring for an infant who was already showing signs of extraordinary ability, Lyanna found herself returning often to the beast stalls where her journey had truly begun. The memorial wall had been expanded to include new inscriptions, words that honoured not just the creatures who had died in captivity, but those who had lived to see the covenant renewed. It was there, sitting on the bench with her son sleeping peacefully in her arms, that she felt the fullness of what she had accomplished. "You did it," she whispered to the stone, speaking to the memory of every creature who had suffered during the dark years. "You held on long enough for the bloodline to return. You kept hope alive when there was no reason to believe things would ever change." Elric stirred in her arms, his tiny hand reaching up to touch her face with the kind of instinctive comfort that suggested he understood more than any month-old child should. When his eyes opened, they held depths of love and recognition that took her breath away. "Mama," came the faintest whisper of telepathic communication, his first clear mental word reaching her consciousness like a gift. Safe, home, pack. The tears that came were tears of joy, of completion, of a story that had begun in darkness and despair, finally reaching the light. She held her son close, feeling the warmth of his small body and the stronger warmth of the mate bond that connected them both to Cale, wherever his duties had taken him that morning. Around them, the kingdom continued its daily life, a realm transformed by the return of ancient alliances and the promise of an heir who would carry those alliances into a future none of them could fully imagine. Shadow cats padded through corridors where they were welcomed rather than feared. Warwolves helped train human guards in techniques that combined conventional warfare with supernatural abilities. Great eagles carried messages between kingdoms whose rulers were eager to learn from the Northern Realm's success. But here, in the quiet of the memorial chamber, surrounded by the memory of those who had sacrificed everything for this moment, Lyanna simply held her son and marvelled at the journey that had brought them both to this place. She was no longer the broken girl who had been chained in the darkness, believing herself worthless and alone. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had discovered power she didn't understand and responsibilities she wasn't sure she could handle. She was Lyanna, Beast Queen of the Northern Realm, mother to the heir who would unite worlds, mate to the Alpha King who had chosen love over political convenience. She was the bridge between species, the protector of the innocent, the keeper of ancient covenants that would endure for generations yet unborn. And as her son settled deeper into sleep against her chest, as the morning light streamed through the windows to illuminate the memorial to those who had made this moment possible, she knew with absolute certainty that every trial, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice had been worth it for the future they had built together. The Beast Queen had returned. The bloodline was secure, and the dawn of a new era stretched before them like a golden road leading toward possibilities none of them could yet imagine. The hours that followed were unlike anything Lyanna had ever experienced. Sleep should have been impossible, chained to a stone wall in the heart of the beast stalls. But the warmth radiating from Fenris's massive form and the soft purring of the shadow cats created a cocoon of safety she had never known. She dozed fitfully, stirring each time a new creature emerged from the darkness to join the growing circle of guardians around her. A pair of silver-backed wolves padded silently from their enclosure, their eyes reflecting the dying torchlight as they settled beside Fenris. 3 more shadow cats materialized like living smoke, their sleek forms finding spaces in the protective formation until she was completely surrounded by fur and fang and fierce loyalty. But it was the ancient bear spirit who commanded her attention. He had not moved from his position directly in front of her, his massive frame a living wall between her and the world beyond. Every few minutes those ancient brown eyes would find hers, and she would feel that same impossible warmth spreading through her chest, that same whispered voice in her mind. You feel it stirring, don't you, little queen? The part of yourself they told you was broken? Her wolf. The part of every shifter that should have emerged during adolescence, that should have given her strength, speed, the ability to defend herself. For years she had believed what everyone told her, that her wolf was too weak, too damaged by her low birth to ever surface. The healers had examined her, shaking their heads in pity. The pack had dismissed her as defective, barely worth acknowledging. But here, surrounded by creatures who radiated power like small suns, she could feel something responding deep in her bones. It was tentative, like a wild animal testing the safety of open ground, but it was there. It was real. They suppressed you, the bear spirit continued, his mental voice carrying centuries of sadness, not through cruelty, though that played its part, through ignorance. They never understood what you truly are. A shadow cat, with distinctive white markings along her throat, lifted her head and fixed Lyanna with glowing amber eyes. For a moment the connection between them flared bright and immediate, and Lyanna gasped as she felt the cat's emotions wash through her. Curiosity, recognition, and underneath it all, a bone-deep certainty that sent shivers down her spine. Pack, alpha, ours. The telepathic voice was different from the bear spirit's, wilder, more primal, but no less real. The shadow cat was speaking to her, mind to mind, the way creatures communicated with those they recognized as kin. "This isn't possible," Lyanna whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of silence. "I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I can't even shift." Fenris raised his great head at the sound of her voice, silver eyes meeting hers with an intensity that stole her breath. When he spoke telepathically, his mental voice carried the weight of authority, the kind of presence that made even alpha wolves submit. "You carry the scent of old power, little one. Ancient bloodlines that predate the current royal house. We know what you are, even if you have forgotten." Asterisk. The words should have been impossible to believe. Bloodlines were carefully tracked in the kingdom, recorded in great books that traced every noble family back generations. She was a foundling, discovered as an infant on the steps of the compound, with no family, no history, no claim to anything more than the charity that kept her fed and housed. But as she sat there in the flickering torchlight, feeling the steady pulse of supernatural recognition flowing between herself and the creatures around her, she began to wonder what other lies she had been told. The ancient bear spirit shifted closer, his massive paw coming to rest just inches from her chained hands. The proximity should have terrified her, but instead she felt drawn to touch him, to make physical contact with the creature who seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Your bloodline carries the old covenant," he continued, his mental voice gentle despite the power behind it. "The pact between the human royal house and the creatures of the wild places. But it was more than politics, little queen. It was blood calling to blood, power recognizing power. The first queen of this land was one of us. Her breath caught. One of you. A shifter whose wolf could speak to all creatures, not just her own kind. A bridge between worlds. A translator of needs and wants and ancient grievances. She founded this kingdom on the principle that human and beast could coexist, could protect each other. Around her, the creatures stirred with something that felt like reverence. The silver-backed wolves pressed closer, their warm bodies creating a barrier against the cold stone. The shadow cats began a low, synchronized purring that resonated in her chest like a lullaby. But the bloodline was thought lost, the bear spirit continued. Generations passed without a beast queen, and the humans forgot what they owed to the old covenants. They began to see us as pets, as weapons, as problems to be contained, rather than allies to be honoured. Lyanna thought of the beast stalls around her, of the iron cages and reinforced barriers designed to contain rather than comfort. She thought of the way the creatures were brought here when they became inconvenient, locked away from the world they had helped to build. "You feel the injustice of it," Fenris observed, his silver eyes reflecting her growing anger. "Good. That fire will serve you well in the trials ahead." "What trials?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. The ancient bear spirit's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing possibilities that stretched far beyond this moment. "Your awakening has begun, but it is only the beginning. Those who benefit from the current order will not surrender their power easily. They will try to convince the world that you are dangerous, that the old ways were abandoned for good reason." A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone at her back. "Seraphina," among others the bear spirit confirmed. "But you will not face them alone. The covenant works both ways, little queen. As you awaken to what you truly are, so too do we remember what we were meant to be." Around her, the creatures shifted in agreement, their mental voices joining in a chorus of fierce loyalty that brought tears to her eyes. For the first time in her life, she was not alone. For the first time, she belonged somewhere. But even as warmth flooded through her at the realization, a shadow of fear crept in. If what they were saying was true, if she really did carry some ancient bloodline, then everything was about to change. And change, in her experience, rarely came without a price. The shadow cat with white markings nudged her hand with a warm nose, and Lyanna felt a pulse of comfort flow between them. "No fear," the cat's mental voice whispered. "We have waited so long for you to come home. Whatever comes next, you will not face it as the frightened girl they tried to make you. You will face it as what you were always meant to be." In the distance, Lyanna could hear the first stirrings of dawn patrol, guards beginning their rounds as the night shift prepared to hand over their duties. Soon, someone would come to check on her, expecting to find a corpse torn apart by savage beasts. Instead, they would find something that would shake the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about power, about bloodlines, about the ancient compacts that held their kingdom together. "Let them come," Fenris rumbled, his mental voice carrying a note of anticipation that should have been terrifying. "It is time for the world to remember what they chose to forget." The ancient bear spirit lifted his great head, his brown eyes meeting hers one final time before dawn could steal away the magic of this impossible night. "Rest now, little queen. Tomorrow your real education begins." Dawn broke over the kingdom with cruel efficiency, painting the beast stalls in harsh light that did nothing to diminish the impossible scene within. Lyanna had managed a few hours of restless sleep, her body pressed against Fenris's warm side, while shadow cats kept watch from their positions around her. She woke to the sound of boots on stone, multiple pairs, moving with the urgent cadence of men who expected to find blood and carnage. The ancient bear spirit lifted his massive head as the footsteps approached, his brown eyes alert but calm. Around her, the creatures stirred, but maintained their protective formation, a living wall of fur and fang that would give even the bravest warriors pause. "This way," came a voice she recognised as Captain Morris, the head of the Dawn Guard. "The Alpha King wants to see what's left of her before we clear out the remains." Alpha King Kale's voice cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp with barely contained fury. "If any of you touched her before the beasts had their chance, I'll have you flogged." Lyanna's heart stuttered at the sound of his voice, so close, so filled with protective rage. The mate bond that had been growing between them over the past weeks pulled tight in her chest, a golden thread of connection that made her wolf stir with recognition and longing. The footsteps stopped just beyond the reach of the torchlight, and she heard Captain Morris's sharp intake of breath. "My lord, what in the seven hells?" Kyle stepped into view, his massive frame filling the archway that led to her section of the stalls. He was dressed for battle, his leather armour still bearing traces of mud and blood from whatever conflict had kept him away through the night. His dark hair was dishevelled, his green eyes blazing with the kind of fury that made grown men step carefully around him. But the moment his gaze fell on her, surrounded by her impossible guardians, the anger transformed into something else entirely. Wonder, recognition, and underneath it all, a fierce possessive satisfaction that sent heat racing through her veins. Lyanna. Her name on his lips was part relief, part reverence, part something she didn't dare name. She tried to stand, but the chains around her wrists held her in place. The sound of metal against stone made Fenris growl low in his throat, a rumble of displeasure that had Captain Morris reaching for his sword. "Don't!" Kyle's command stopped the captain's hand before it could clear the scabbard. "Don't even think about threatening them!" Behind him, more guards had gathered, their faces pale with shock and fear as they took in the unprecedented scene. The kingdom's most dangerous creatures, the ones that required iron cages and armed escorts, were lying peacefully around a chained prisoner like devoted pets. "My lord," Captain Morris began carefully, "this isn't natural. Beasts don't behave like this. Something's wrong with them." Kale stepped closer, ignoring the way the shadow cats tracked his movement with glowing eyes, ignoring the massive war-wolf whose head came up to his chest. His attention was focused entirely on Lyanna, on the wonder and confusion written across her face. "There's nothing wrong with them," he said quietly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha who would not be questioned. "They're recognizing what the rest of us have been too blind to see." The ancient bear spirit rose to his full height, a mountain of silver-white fur and ancient power that made even Kale pause in respect. The great creature studied the Alpha King with intelligent eyes, and Lyanna felt the familiar brush of telepathic communication flow between them. What passed in that moment of silent communion, she couldn't say, but she saw Kale's expression shift from wariness to understanding to something that looked very much like awe. "The bloodline," he breathed, his green eyes snapping back to hers. "You carry the Beast Queen bloodline." Around him, his guards exchanged uneasy glances. Captain Morris stepped forward, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "My lord, with respect, the Beast Queen line died out centuries ago. Every scholar agrees. Every scholar was wrong." Kyle's voice carried the kind of finality that ended arguments before they could begin. He moved closer, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his green eyes, close enough that the mate bond hummed with recognition between them. "Look at them. Really look at them. When in recorded history has a war-wolf ever positioned itself as a shield for a human? When have shadow cats ever purred in the presence of someone they didn't consider pack?" Fenris chose that moment to prove the point, rising from his protective position beside Lyanna to pad closer to Kale. The massive wolf was nearly as tall as the Alpha King's shoulder, his silver eyes meeting Kale's with something that looked very much like approval. Kyle extended his hand, palm up, in the ancient gesture of respect between equals. Fenris sniffed once, then pressed his great muzzle against the offered palm in acceptance. "He's accepting you as her mate," Kale murmured, wonder creeping into his voice. "He's acknowledging the bond." The words hit Lyanna like a physical blow. The mate bond she had felt growing between them, the pull that had been getting stronger every day despite the political impossibility of it all, was real. It was recognized not just by her heart, but by creatures whose supernatural senses could detect truth that human politics tried to deny. Behind Kale, Captain Morris was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "My lord, Lady Seraphina sent word that she expects to see the prisoner's remains before the morning meal. She wanted confirmation that the threat had been dealt with." The temperature in the stalls seemed to drop several degrees. Kyle's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, and around Lyanna the creatures responded to his shift in mood. The shadow cats rose to their feet, their amber eyes beginning to glow with predatory light. Fenris turned away from Kyle to fix the guards with a stare that promised violence. Did she now? Kyle's voice was deceptively calm, the kind of quiet that preceded devastating storms. "And tell me, Captain, who gave Lady Seraphina the authority to order executions in my kingdom?" Captain Morris paled. "She said it was by your command, my lord, that you had ordered the prisoner taken to the beast stalls as punishment for disrupting the negotiations." "I was fighting border raids all night," Kyle said, his voice getting quieter and more dangerous with each word. "I never gave any such order. In fact, the last thing I remember hearing was Miss Lyanna making a very reasonable point about the kingdom's defence needs during the treaty discussions." The implication hung in the air like a sword. If Kyle hadn't ordered her imprisonment, then someone had acted without his authority. Someone had used his name to condemn an innocent woman to death. The ancient bear spirit moved closer to Lyanna, his massive form radiating protective menace. When he spoke telepathically, his mental voice was grim with centuries of experience. "The one who orchestrated this will not stop here, little queen. This was a test, to see if they could act against you without consequence. When you emerge from this place alive and recognized by the old powers, they will escalate." Kyle was unlocking her shackles now, his fingers gentle despite the fury radiating from every line of his body. The moment the iron fell away from her wrists, Lyanna felt something shift inside her, as if the metal had been suppressing more than just her freedom. Her wolf stirred, stronger now, more present. She could feel it testing the edges of her consciousness, no longer weak and broken, but fierce and ready for whatever came next. "We need to get you out of here," Kyle murmured, helping her to her feet. His hands were warm and solid, and where he touched her, the mate bond flared bright and certain. "But first, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Around them, the creatures began to move. Not away, as they should have now that dawn had broken and their natural nocturnal instincts called them back to rest. Instead, they moved closer, forming an honour guard around her as she took her first steps as a free woman. As they walked toward the entrance of the stalls, Lyanna could hear voices in the distance, people gathering to witness whatever spectacle Seraphina had planned. They would be expecting to see a broken girl torn apart by savage beasts, confirmation that those who stepped out of line would face swift and brutal justice. Instead, they were about to see something that would shake the very foundations of their carefully ordered world. They were about to see the Beast Queen reborn, flanked by creatures who had waited centuries for her return. The ancient bear spirit padded beside her, his mental voice warm with something that might have been pride. "Let them see what they have awakened, little queen. Let them understand that some bloodlines cannot be chained, cannot be broken, cannot be denied." Kyle's hand found hers as they reached the threshold between darkness and light, between the woman she had been and whatever she was becoming. His fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt his strength flowing through the mate bond, ready to face whatever waited beyond. "Together," he said simply, and she knew that everything was about to change. The procession from the beast stalls to the royal archives became a spectacle unlike anything the kingdom had ever witnessed. Word had spread like wildfire through the compound that the Alpha King was walking through the courtyards with a prisoner who should have been dead, flanked by creatures that should have been caged. Lyanna felt every stare like a physical weight as they moved through the stone corridors. Servants pressed themselves against walls, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as Fenris padded beside her, his massive form radiating protective menace. The shadow cats flowed around them like liquid darkness, their amber eyes tracking every movement, every potential threat. But it was the ancient bear spirit who commanded the most attention. He moved with the measured dignity of royalty, his silver-white fur catching the morning light that streamed through the high windows. People dropped to their knees as he passed, some in terror, others in the kind of instinctive reverence reserved for beings whose power transcended human understanding. "This is impossible," she heard someone whisper as they passed. "The beasts haven't left the stalls in decades. Not since the last beastkeeper died." Kyle's hand tightened around hers, and she felt his satisfaction pulse through the mate bond. He was making a statement, she realised. By walking her through the compound in full view of everyone, surrounded by her supernatural guardians, he was declaring something that words alone could never accomplish. The archives were housed in the oldest part of the royal compound, a tower that predated even the current castle by several centuries. As they climbed the winding stone stairs, Lyanna could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, generations of accumulated knowledge and carefully guarded secrets. Elder Thane was waiting for them at the entrance to the main archive chamber, his ancient face creased with concern and curiosity in equal measure. He was the kingdom's oldest scholar, a man who had served 3 generations of Alpha Kings and was said to know more about bloodlines and royal history than anyone living. His pale blue eyes took in the impossible procession with the kind of sharp intelligence that had kept him valuable to the crown for over 60 years. When his gaze fell on the ancient bear spirit, something shifted in his expression, a recognition that went bone deep. "My lord," he said to Kyle, his voice carefully controlled, "I received your message about researching unusual bloodline manifestations. I must say, I wasn't expecting quite so dramatic a demonstration." The bear spirit approached the elderly scholar, lowering his great head in what was unmistakably a gesture of respect. Elder Thane's breath caught, and he returned the bow with the kind of formality reserved for greeting foreign royalty. "He remembers the old protocols," the bear spirit's mental voice whispered in Lyanna's mind. "Good. We will have need of his knowledge in the days ahead." "Elder Thane," Kale said, his voice carrying the weight of royal command, "I need you to research everything we have on the Beast Queen bloodline. Everything, even the records that are supposed to be sealed." The old man's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "The Beast Queen line, my lord, but that bloodline was declared extinct over 3 centuries ago. The last confirmed Beast Queen died during the War of 5 Clans, and her children were lost in the chaos that followed." "Were they?" Kyle asked quietly, his green eyes fixed on Lyanna's face. "Or were they hidden, protected, allowed to disappear into obscurity until the time was right for them to emerge again?" Elder Thane followed Kale's gaze, his sharp eyes studying Lyanna with new intensity. She could feel him cataloguing details, noting the way the creatures positioned themselves around her, the way they responded to her presence with a deference that defied their natural instincts. "Show me," the old scholar said simply. What followed was hours of dusty tomes and ancient parchments, records that hadn't been disturbed in generations being pulled from their carefully preserved storage. The creatures settled around the research area like living furniture, their presence a constant reminder that this was no academic exercise. The first breakthrough came when Elder Thane located a genealogy scroll that traced the Beast Queen line through its various branches. His finger traced the careful script, following bloodlines through marriages and births, and the inevitable losses that came with ruling a kingdom perpetually at war. "Here," he said, pointing to a section near the bottom of the scroll. "Lady Morwenna, the last confirmed Beast Queen. She had 3 children, all daughters. The eldest died in battle alongside her mother. The second married into the Eastern clans, and her line is well documented. But the youngest?" He trailed off, his eyes widening as he read the carefully inscribed notes in the margin. "The youngest was named Lyanna," Elder Thane whispered, "and according to this record, she disappeared during the chaos of the war's final battle. Presumed dead, but her body was never found." Around them the creatures stirred with something that felt like recognition, like pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle finally clicking into place. The ancient bear spirit lifted his great head, his brown eyes finding Lyanna's with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Names echo through bloodlines," he said telepathically. "Power calls to power across centuries. You carry more than just her name, little queen." Elder Thane was already pulling more records, his movements quick and precise despite his age. If the youngest daughter survived, if she had children of her own, and those children had children. He looked up at Lyanna, his pale eyes bright with discovery. The bloodline could have continued in secret, hidden among the common folk, suppressed but never truly lost. "But why suppress it?" Lyanna asked, finding her voice for the first time since they had entered the archives. "Why hide something so powerful?" The answer came not from Elder Thane, but from a voice at the chamber entrance, cold and sharp as winter steel. "Because power like that is dangerous in the wrong hands." They all turned to find Seraphina standing in the doorway, flanked by a dozen of her supporters from the noble houses. She was dressed in court finery, her golden hair arranged in an elaborate style that spoke of hours of careful preparation. But her blue eyes held a coldness that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. The creatures reacted immediately to her presence. Fenris rose to his feet, his lips pulling back from fangs that could tear through armour. The shadow cats flowed into defensive positions, their amber eyes beginning to glow with predatory light. The ancient bear spirit moved to place his massive bulk between Seraphina and Lyanna, a living wall of ancient power and protective instinct. "Lady Seraphina," Cale said, his voice dangerously quiet, "I don't recall inviting you to join our research session." She stepped into the chamber despite the obvious threat posed by the creatures, her chin lifted in defiance. "I came as soon as I heard about this display, really, Cale, parading dangerous beasts through the compound. Someone could have been hurt." "The only danger here," Cale replied, his green eyes blazing with barely controlled fury, "comes from those who act without authority and then lie about their orders." Seraphina's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of something that might have been fear or anger crossing her beautiful features. "I have no idea what you mean." "Don't you?" The ancient bear spirit's mental voice was so powerful that everyone in the room could hear it, pressing against their minds with the weight of centuries. "You orchestrated her imprisonment. You used the Alpha King's name to condemn an innocent woman to death. And when that failed, you come here to sow doubt about discoveries that threaten your carefully laid plans." Seraphina stumbled backward, her face pale with shock. "It spoke. The creature spoke in my mind." "He has a name," Lyanna said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "And he's more ancient and honourable than anyone in this room. Show him the respect he deserves." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment nobody moved. Then Seraphina's expression hardened into something ugly and dangerous. "You think because you've managed to bewitch a few beasts you can challenge your betters? You're still nothing but a foundling with delusions of grandeur." It was the wrong thing to say. The creatures erupted into motion, not attacking, but positioning themselves in a formation that spoke of coordinated defence, of a pack responding to a threat against their leader. The very air seemed to crackle with supernatural energy, and Seraphina's supporters took several nervous steps backward. But it was Lyanna who commanded attention, her grey eyes beginning to glow with an inner light that had never been there before. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made even Seraphina pause. "I may have been a foundling," she said quietly, "but I am no longer nothing. And if you ever threaten me or mine again, you will discover exactly what it means to stand against the Beast Queen bloodline." The silence that followed was broken only by Elder Thane's sharp intake of breath as he looked up from the genealogy scroll in his hands. "My lords and ladies," he said, his voice filled with wonder and not a little fear, "I believe we have found our confirmation. The bloodline lives. The Beast Queen has returned." The emergency council session that convened within hours of Elder Thane's declaration was unlike any in the kingdom's history. The great hall buzzed with tension as nobles, advisers, and military commanders filed in to witness what many were calling either a miracle or a catastrophe, depending on their political allegiances. Lyanna sat at Kyle's right hand, a position traditionally reserved for his queen, acutely aware of every whispered conversation and hostile stare. The creatures had taken positions around the perimeter of the hall, their presence a constant reminder that the old order was shifting beneath everyone's feet. Fenris lay at her feet like a living shadow, his silver eyes tracking every movement in the room. The shadow cats had positioned themselves at strategic points, while the ancient bear spirit had claimed a space near the great hearth, his massive form radiating ancient authority. Lord Aldrich, the kingdom's chancellor, called the session to order with barely concealed nervousness. "We are gathered to address the developments concerning Miss Lyanna and the claims regarding her bloodline." "Claims?" Cale's voice cut through the formal proceedings like a blade. "Elder Thane has provided genealogical evidence spanning 3 centuries. The creatures themselves have acknowledged her authority. What more proof do you require?" Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, some supportive, others sceptical. Lord Blackwood, one of Seraphina's staunchest allies, rose from his seat with the kind of careful dignity that barely concealed hostility. "My lord, with all due respect, genealogical records can be forged. As for the creatures—" He glanced nervously at Fenris, who had lifted his great head to study the speaker with predatory interest. "Well, animals can be trained, manipulated. We've all heard stories of charlatan beast tamers who use tricks to create the appearance of supernatural connection." The ancient bear spirit's mental voice rolled through the hall like thunder, reaching every mind present with the weight of centuries. "Manipulation, Lord Blackwood? Is that what you call the covenant that founded this very kingdom? The alliance between human and beast that has protected your borders for over 400 years? Lord Blackwood stumbled backward, his face pale with shock. Around the hall, other nobles who had never experienced telepathic communication stared in terrified fascination. Seraphina rose gracefully from her seat, her golden hair catching the light from the great chandeliers. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of honeyed poison that had made her so effective in court politics. "Ancient spirits may speak with impressive voices," she said, her blue eyes fixed on Lyanna with undisguised hatred, "but that doesn't change the fact that unleashing such power could destabilize not just our kingdom, but every neighbouring realm. The Beast Queen line was allowed to die out for good reasons." "What reasons?" Elder Thane demanded, rising from his place among the scholars. "The historical records show nothing but prosperity during the Beast Queen reigns. Peaceful borders, abundant harvests, protection from supernatural threats that other kingdoms couldn't handle." "And what happens when that power is corrupted?" Seraphina countered. "When someone with the ability to command every creature in the realm decides they want more than just our kingdom? The Eastern clans still tell stories of beast queens who turned their animal armies against human settlements." Lyanna felt the mate bond pulse with Cale's anger, his protective instincts flaring at the accusations being hurled at her. But it was her own voice that responded, carrying a strength she was still learning to recognize. "The Eastern clans tell a lot of stories," she said quietly, rising to her feet. "Most of them designed to justify their own failures. But since we're discussing historical precedent, perhaps we should examine what happened to the last Beast Queen." She gestured to Elder Thane, who nodded and unfurled another ancient scroll. "Lady Morwenna didn't die in battle because she was power-hungry or corrupted. She died defending this kingdom's borders against a coalition of 5 neighbouring realms who had decided that the Beast Queen line was too dangerous to be allowed to continue." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the assembly. Even some of Seraphina's supporters looked troubled by this revelation. "The War of 5 Clans wasn't a civil conflict," Lyanna continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It was an invasion. 5 kingdoms united by their fear of what they couldn't control, determined to eliminate the bloodline that had kept the supernatural threats at bay for generations." Lord Commander Hayes, the grizzled veteran who led the kingdom's military forces, leaned forward in his seat. "Are you saying the historical accounts we've been taught are incomplete?" Elder Thane nodded grimly. "Deliberately so. The survivors rewrote the records to paint Lady Morwenna as a tragic figure who died in domestic conflict, not as a defender who gave her life, protecting the realm from foreign invasion. It was easier to accept than admitting we had lost our greatest asset to political fear." Around the hall the mood was shifting. Nobles who had entered the session determined to oppose Lyanna's recognition were beginning to look uncertain. The military commanders, in particular, were studying the creatures with new interest, clearly calculating the strategic advantages of having such allies. But Seraphina wasn't finished. She moved to the centre of the hall, her voice carrying to every corner as she delivered what was clearly a prepared speech. "Even if we accept that the bloodline is legitimate, even if we acknowledge that Miss Lyanna carries this ancient power, we must ask ourselves what price we're willing to pay for it. Already the neighbouring kingdoms are sending envoys, asking questions about the disturbances at our borders. They know something has changed. They know something has awakened." She turned to face the assembled nobles, her expression grave with manufactured concern. "How long before they decide that history is repeating itself? How long before another coalition forms, determined to eliminate what they see as a threat? Are we prepared to face the combined armies of 5 kingdoms again? Are we willing to watch our people die for the sake of one woman's claim to power?" The hall fell silent. It was a masterful argument, Lyanna had to admit. Seraphina had taken the very evidence of her legitimacy and turned it into a weapon, making her heritage sound like a curse that would bring destruction down on everyone she cared about. The ancient bear spirit rose to his full height, his massive form commanding attention from every person in the room. When he spoke, his mental voice carried not anger, but a sadness that spanned centuries. "You speak of fear as if it were wisdom, Lady Seraphina. But fear is what led to the War of 5 Clans. Fear is what convinced 5 kingdoms to unite against a single defender. Fear is what caused the bloodline to be hidden for 3 centuries, leaving this realm vulnerable to threats that only a Beast Queen could face." He padded closer to the centre of the hall, his ancient eyes taking in every face, every expression of doubt or determination. The creatures of the wild places have been stirring for months now. Things that should sleep have awakened. Ancient grudges that should remain buried are surfacing. The neighbouring kingdoms send envoys, not because they fear what has returned, but because they hope to find protection from what is coming. A chill ran through the assembled nobles. Lord Commander Hayes was the first to speak, his gruff voice cutting through the sudden tension. "What kind of threats?" The ancient bear spirit's mental voice grew grim, the kind that destroyed civilizations before the first Beast Queen forged the covenants that hold them at bay. Shadow wraiths that devour light itself. Stone giants that rise from mountain roots to reclaim lands they consider stolen. Ice spirits that can freeze entire armies with a breath. Around the hall, the military commanders were exchanging increasingly worried glances. These were threats from the oldest legends, the kind of supernatural dangers that modern warfare was simply not equipped to handle. The bloodline was never just about political power, the bear spirit continued. It was about survival, about maintaining the balance between the human world and the forces that would see it consumed. Without a beast queen to renew the ancient compacts, to speak for both sides when the old grievances resurface, this kingdom will face threats that no army can defeat. Kyle rose from his throne, his presence filling the hall with alpha authority. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute command. "The decision is mine to make," he said, his green eyes sweeping across the assembled nobles. "And I choose to honour the bloodlines that built this kingdom, to embrace the alliances that have protected our people for centuries. Lyanna carries the Beast Queen heritage, and she will be recognised as such." Seraphina's perfect composure finally cracked, her blue eyes blazing with fury. "You would risk everything for a mate bond that defies political necessity? You would choose personal desire over the safety of the realm?" The mate bond flared between them, golden and fierce and absolutely certain. Kale's eyes found Lyanna's across the hall, and she felt his love and determination flow through their connection like molten fire. "I choose the woman who was willing to speak truth to power even when it meant facing death," he said quietly. "I choose the bloodline that has protected this kingdom since its founding. I choose the future over the fear of the past." The ancient bear spirit's mental voice carried approval, and something that might have been relief. "The choice is made then. Now we must prepare for what comes next, because those who destroyed the last Beast Queen will not hesitate to try again." The gardens had always been Lyanna's sanctuary, a place where she could walk among the flowering herbs and think without the weight of stares and whispered conversations. 3 days had passed since the council session, and the tension in the compound had only grown thicker. She needed air, needed the familiar comfort of growing things, an open sky. She should have known that nowhere was truly safe anymore. The first arrow came from the rose arbour, a whisper of steel and fletching that would have taken her through the heart if not for the shadow cat who materialised from thin air to intercept it. The poisoned tip sank deep into the cat's shoulder, and Lyanna watched in horror as her protector stumbled, dark ichor spreading from the wound. "No!" The word tore from her throat as she dropped to her knees beside the injured cat, her hands hovering over the wound as she felt the creature's pain pulse through their connection. The poison was designed specifically for supernatural beings, she realised with growing rage. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned, calculated, meant to kill not just her, but any creature that tried to protect her. The second arrow came from the herb garden, aimed at her exposed back as she knelt beside the fallen shadow cat. This time it was Fenris who intervened, his massive form crashing through the carefully tended lavender to knock her aside as the projectile whistled past her ear. More arrows followed, a coordinated assault from multiple positions around the garden. Whoever had planned this had studied the layout carefully, positioned their archers to create a killing field with no escape routes, but they had underestimated what they were hunting. The ancient bear spirit's roar shattered the afternoon quiet, a sound so deep and primal that it seemed to shake the very stones of the compound. Every creature within miles heard that call and understood its meaning. The Beast Queen was under attack. They came from every direction. Warwolves that had been sleeping in the deeper kennels burst through garden gates with their eyes blazing silver fire. Shadow cats materialised from patches of darkness that shouldn't have been large enough to hide them. Even the smaller creatures, the messenger hawks and hunting hounds, descended on the garden with lethal intent. The assassins had planned for arrows and stealth. They had not planned for an army. Lyanna watched in fascinated horror as her protectors tore through the garden with surgical precision, hunting down the hidden archers with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of ancient pack instincts. She heard screams cut short, the sound of men who had expected to face a helpless girl discovering they were prey instead of predators. Fenris returned to her side with blood on his muzzle, dragging something in his jaws that made her stomach turn. A piece of cloth torn from an assassin's sleeve, bearing the subtle embroidery that marked it as belonging to House Ravencrest, Seraphina's house. "My lady!" Kyle's voice cut through the chaos as he burst into the garden, his sword already drawn, his alpha authority radiating outward in waves that would have made lesser men drop to their knees. He took in the scene with the kind of swift assessment that came from years of battlefield command. The injured shadow cat, the torn earth where arrows had struck, the pieces of assassins that his mate's protectors were still dragging from their hiding places. His green eyes blazed with a fury that made the air around him shimmer with heat. "How many?" "6," the ancient bear spirit's mental voice replied, his massive form padding into view with something that looked very much like grim satisfaction. "All dead. All bearing the mark of House Ravencrest." Cale's expression grew cold and deadly. "Seraphina." Around them, the creatures were forming their familiar protective circle, but something had changed. The injured shadow cat was struggling to rise, her amber eyes beginning to glow with an inner light that spoke of rage rather than pain. The other cats were responding to her distress with a synchronized growling that made the very air vibrate with menace. But it was what was happening inside Lyanna herself that commanded her attention. The rage that had been building since the first arrow was released was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It burned through her veins like liquid fire, awakening parts of herself that had been sleeping for 23 years. Her wolf was rising. Not the weak, broken thing she had always been told she carried, but something fierce and ancient and absolutely furious that anyone had dared to hurt her pack. She could feel it clawing its way to the surface, demanding release, demanding the right to hunt down every person who had participated in this attack. "Lyanna." Cale's voice was gentle despite the violence surrounding them. He knelt beside her, his hands reaching for hers, and she realized she was shaking. "Are you hurt?" She met his eyes, and he stepped back at whatever he saw there. Her wolf was so close to the surface now that she could feel it looking out through her gaze, marking everything in the garden as either pack or threat. "I'm not hurt," she said, her voice carrying a resonance that hadn't been there before. "But they will be." The ancient bear spirit moved closer, his brown eyes studying her with something that looked like approval. "Your wolf has tasted its first real threat, little queen. It wants blood for blood, protection for protection. This is natural. This is right." Kyle was looking between her and the injured shadow cat, understanding dawning on his face. "The bond. You feel what they feel." "Every arrow that struck them struck me," she confirmed, rising to her feet with a fluid grace that was entirely new. "Every drop of poison in their veins burns in mine. They protected me with their lives, and my wolf wants to do the same for them." Around them, more creatures were arriving. Not just the ones from the compound, but wild ones from the forests beyond. Wolves whose loyalty belonged to no human pack. Great cats whose territories spanned the borderlands. Even a pair of eagles whose wingspans cast shadows like storm clouds. They were answering the call of their queen. Seraphina chose that moment to arrive with her retinue, her face a perfect mask of concern and shock. "My lord, what happened here?" "We heard the commotion and came as quickly as we could." The ancient bear spirit's mental voice rolled across the garden like thunder, reaching every mind present with devastating clarity. "You came quickly indeed, Lady Seraphina, almost as if you knew exactly when to expect the disturbance." She stumbled backward, her perfect composure cracking. "I don't know what you mean. Why would I know anything about an attack on Miss Lyanna?" Fenris approached her with predatory slowness, the torn cloth still dangling from his jaws. He dropped it at her feet, and several of her supporters gasped as they recognized the embroidery of their own house. "House Ravencrest," Kyle said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that preceded executions. "Your assassins were sloppy, Serafina. They left evidence." "That could belong to anyone," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Half the noble houses have similar patterns. You can't possibly think that I can think it because I know it." Liana's voice cut through Serafina's protests like a blade. She stepped forward, and every creature in the garden moved with her, a living tide of fur and fang and absolute loyalty. "My wolf can smell the truth on you, Serafina. The fear, the guilt, the desperate hunger for power that drove you to try to murder me in broad daylight." For the first time since Liana had known her, Serafina looked truly afraid. She was staring at the assembled creatures, at the way they moved in perfect coordination around their queen, at the growing crowd of wild things that were still arriving from the forests beyond. "This is what I warned the council about," she said, her voice rising with something that might have been hysteria. "Look at her. Look at what she's becoming. She's gathering an army, calling creatures from across the realm to serve her will. How long before she decides the kingdom itself isn't enough?" "The only person here who has demonstrated a hunger for power," Kyle said coldly, "is you. The only person who has resorted to violence and murder is you. The only person who poses a threat to this kingdom's stability is you." The injured shadow cat had struggled to her feet, supported by two of her packmates. Her amber eyes found Liana's across the garden, and when she spoke telepathically, her mental voice was fierce with loyalty despite her pain. "Command us, my queen. Give us the word, and we will hunt down every person who supported this attack. We will make them understand the price of threatening our pack." For a moment, Liana was tempted. The rage burning through her veins demanded justice, demanded blood for blood. It would be so easy to loose her creatures on Serafina's faction, to let them tear apart everyone who had participated in this betrayal. But that would make her the monster Serafina claimed she was. Instead, she looked directly at Serafina, her grey eyes blazing with inner light, and spoke with the authority of someone who no longer doubted what she was meant to become. "You made your choice when you sent assassins after me," she said quietly. "You declared war on the Beast Queen bloodline, but I am not the savage you want me to be. I will not stain my reign with unnecessary blood, no matter how richly it might be deserved." She gestured to the creatures around her, and they responded instantly, forming ranks like a supernatural army awaiting orders. "But understand this, Serafina. You have shown me what you are willing to do to claim power. You have proven that you see murder as an acceptable tool of politics. The creatures of this realm will never forget that lesson. And neither will I." The ancient bear spirit's mental voice carried finality. "The old covenants are awakening, Lady Serafina. The compacts that have protected this kingdom for centuries are being renewed. You would do well to remember that those same agreements that offer protection to the innocent also promise swift justice for those who break the ancient laws." Serafina's face had gone pale, but her eyes still burned with defiant hatred. "This isn't over." "No," Liana agreed, her voice carrying the promise of storms to come. "It isn't. But when it ends, it won't be because I chose violence over justice. It will be because you chose to stand against forces you never understood and could never control." As Serafina and her faction retreated from the garden, Liana knelt beside the injured shadow cat, her hands gentle as she examined the wound. The poison was powerful, but not fatal. Her protector would heal. They all would heal, and when they did, they would be stronger than ever before. The transformation began at twilight, 3 days after the assassination attempt, when the moon rose full and silver over the compound. Liana had felt it building in her bones all day, a restless energy that made her skin feel too tight, and her wolf pace endlessly beneath the surface of her consciousness. She stood in the sacred grove that bordered the eastern edge of the palace grounds, the ancient trees forming a natural amphitheatre around a clearing that had been used for ceremonial purposes since the kingdom's founding. Kyle stood at the edge of the circle, his presence a steady anchor through the mate bond, while the creatures that had sworn themselves to her service formed concentric rings around the clearing. The ancient bear spirit had guided her here as the sun set, his mental voice gentle but insistent. "Tonight, little queen, tonight you stop hiding from what you are and embrace what you were always meant to become." Every supernatural being in the kingdom seemed to have gathered for this moment. War-wolves sat shoulder to shoulder with shadow cats, their ancient rivalries forgotten in the face of something unprecedented. Great eagles perched in the surrounding trees, their wings catching the moonlight like silver shields. Even creatures she had never seen before had emerged from the deep forests, drawn by something that transcended mere curiosity. They were here to witness the rebirth of their queen. The pain began in her spine, a burning sensation that spread outward through every nerve ending until she felt as if she were being consumed by fire. She had heard others describe their first shift as uncomfortable, awkward, a learning process that took time to master. This was nothing like that. This was power that had been compressed and contained for 23 years, finally exploding outward with the force of a dam bursting. She heard herself scream, but the sound that emerged from her throat was already changing, becoming something wilder, more primal. Her bones cracked and reformed with audible snaps that should have been agony, but instead felt like relief, like joints that had been locked in wrong positions, finally sliding into their proper places. Her spine elongated, her limbs reshaped themselves, her face pushed forward into a muzzle lined with teeth that could tear through armour. But it was her fur that marked her as something extraordinary. Silver, not the common grey of ordinary wolves, but true silver that seemed to capture and hold the moonlight, making her glow like a creature made of starlight and dreams. And across her coat, ancient markings appeared as if written by moonbeams themselves, spiralling patterns that spoke of bloodlines so old they predated written history. When the transformation completed, she stood in the centre of the grove as something that had never existed before. She was larger than any normal wolf, nearly the size of Fenris himself, but where his presence spoke of barely contained violence, hers radiated authority that needed no force to command obedience. The ancient bear spirit approached her slowly, his massive head lowered in respect. When he spoke, his mental voice carried wonder and something that might have been profound relief. Behold the Beast Queen reborn, not as she was, but as she was always meant to be. Around the grove, every creature present lowered themselves in recognition. Warwolves that answered to no human authority pressed their bellies to the ground. Shadow cats that had never acknowledged any power greater than their own laid their sleek heads against the earth. Even the great eagles folded their wings and bent their necks in submission. But they were not submitting to dominance or fear. They were acknowledging something that their deepest instincts recognized as right, as natural, as the missing piece that had left them all feeling incomplete for generations. Lyanna tested her new form, feeling the incredible strength coiled in her muscles, the enhanced senses that brought her information about every living thing within miles. She could smell the individual scents of every creature in the grove, could hear their heartbeats, could sense their emotions as clearly as if they were her own. And through it all, the telepathic connections that had been tentative before now blazed bright and certain. She could speak to all of them simultaneously, could feel their loyalty and love flowing back to her like a tide of warmth that threatened to overwhelm her with its intensity. "My pack," she said, her mental voice reaching every mind present. "My family, my protectors, and my charges. I understand now what I was meant to be." She turned toward Kyle, who had been watching the transformation with an expression of awe and fierce pride. Even in her wolf form, the mate bond between them burned bright and true, a golden thread that connected them soul to soul. "And I understand what we are meant to build together." But it was her next command that truly marked her as different from any beast queen who had come before. Instead of declaring dominion over the creatures gathered around her, instead of asserting the kind of authority that came from power and fear, she spoke to them as equals. "I claim no ownership over you," she said, her mental voice carrying to every corner of the grove. "I offer no chains disguised as protection, no cages justified by safety. You are free to choose your own paths, to live your own lives. But if you choose to stand with me, to help me protect the innocent and preserve the balance between our worlds, then you will have my loyalty in return." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Not the grudging obedience of subjects to a ruler, but the fierce devotion of family members who had finally found their way home. Fenris was the first to approach, his massive form moving with careful respect. When he reached her, he touched his nose to hers in the ancient greeting between equals, and his mental voice carried centuries of lonely waiting finally coming to an end. "I choose to stand with you, my queen, not because I must, but because you are worthy of the choice." One by one, the other creatures followed. Shadow cats that had never trusted any authority outside their own kind pledged themselves to her service. Warwolves whose loyalty had been earned through fear offered it freely through love. Even the great eagles, those most independent of all supernatural beings, acknowledged her as their chosen leader. When the pledging was complete, when every creature in the grove had made their choice, Lyanna lifted her head to the moon and howled. It was a sound unlike anything that had ever echoed through the kingdom before, carrying joy and power and the promise of protection for all who needed it. The howl was answered from every corner of the realm. Creatures that had been hiding in deep forests and mountain caves, beings that had withdrawn from the human world in the centuries since the last Beast Queen died, responded to the call with voices of their own. The Beast Queen had returned. The ancient covenants were renewed. The balance between worlds was restored. But even as she revelled in the rightness of this moment, even as she felt the profound satisfaction of finally becoming who she was meant to be, Lyanna knew that her transformation was only the beginning. Seraphina would not accept this gracefully. Those who had benefited from the old order would not surrender their power without a fight. And beyond the political challenges that awaited her, there were the supernatural threats that the ancient bear spirit had warned about, forces that would test her new abilities in ways she could not yet imagine. Let them come, she thought, feeling the fierce loyalty of her chosen family surrounding her like armour. Let them test what it means to stand against a beast queen who rules not through fear, but through love. As she began the transformation back to her human form, as the silver light faded from her fur and her bones reshaped themselves once again, she carried with her the absolute certainty of what she had become. She was no longer the broken girl who had been chained in the beast's stalls. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had believed herself worthless. She was Lyanna, Beast Queen of the Northern Realm, protector of all who needed protection, bridge between the human world and the wild places beyond. And she was ready for whatever came next. The ancient bear spirit's mental voice followed her back to human consciousness, warm with approval and anticipation. "Now, little queen, your real work begins. The crown awaits, but first you must claim the king who would wear it beside you." The great hall had never seen a gathering like this one. Dawn broke over the kingdom to find nobles, commoners, and creatures assembled together in a ceremony that defied every tradition the realm had ever known. Kyle stood at the centre of it all, no longer just an alpha king, but a man about to make a choice that would reshape the very foundations of his rule. Lyanna approached through the massive oak doors, flanked by her supernatural guardians, her silver gown catching the morning light that streamed through the great windows. But it wasn't her beauty that commanded attention from every person in the hall. It was the aura of power that surrounded her, the way the very air seemed to shimmer with ancient authority whenever she moved. The creatures that accompanied her had arranged themselves with deliberate ceremony. Fenris padded beside her with the dignity of a royal escort, his silver eyes scanning the assembled crowd for any sign of threat. The shadow cats flowed around the edges of the hall like living shadows, their amber eyes reflecting the light from the chandeliers. The ancient bear spirit had positioned himself near the great hearth, his massive presence a reminder that this ceremony was witnessed by powers far older than any human kingdom. "My lords and ladies," Kyle began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "I stand before you today to make a declaration that will change the course of our realm's history." Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles, some supportive, others clearly uncomfortable with what they sensed was coming. Seraphina sat rigidly in her place among the highest-ranking families, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. "For weeks I have been bound by a political engagement designed to secure our borders through alliance," Cale continued, his green eyes finding Lyanna's across the hall. An arrangement that made sense in terms of military strategy and diplomatic necessity, but ignored the deeper truths that govern not just kingdoms, but the supernatural forces that protect them. He stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace of a predator who had never doubted his own power. "I have discovered that those deeper truths cannot be ignored, cannot be suppressed, cannot be sacrificed for political convenience." The mate bond between them pulsed with golden fire as he approached her, and Lyanna felt her wolf stir with recognition and fierce joy. Every creature in the hall could sense the connection between them, the way their very souls seemed to call to each other across the space that separated them. "Lady Seraphina," Cale said, turning to face his former betrothed with the kind of formal courtesy that barely concealed judgment. "You have served this kingdom with dedication, and your family's loyalty has been noted and appreciated. But I cannot in good conscience bind myself to someone whose vision of the future differs so fundamentally from my own." Seraphina rose to her feet, her blue eyes blazing with humiliation and rage. "You would break a legally binding engagement for the sake of a girl whose very existence threatens the stability of our realm." "I would honour the mate bond that was recognised by forces older than any legal contract," Kyle replied, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha who would not be questioned. "I would embrace the alliance that has protected this kingdom for centuries, not the political arrangement that asks me to deny supernatural law." Around the hall, the creatures stirred in approval, their mental voices creating a chorus of support that only those with supernatural senses could fully appreciate. The ancient bear spirit's telepathic communication reached every mind present, his words carrying the weight of centuries. The Alpha King speaks truth. The mate bond supersedes all human law, all political necessity. It is the foundation upon which the old covenants were built, the recognition that some connections transcend the boundaries between species and realms. Lord Blackwood, ever Seraphina's most vocal supporter, stood from his place among the nobles. "My lord, surely you cannot expect us to accept that supernatural forces should dictate the political future of our kingdom." It was Lyanna who answered, her voice carrying the quiet authority she had discovered during her transformation. "The supernatural forces, Lord Blackwood, are what created this kingdom in the first place. The alliance between human and beast, the covenants that have kept your borders safe for 4 centuries, the balance that has allowed your people to prosper while other realms fell to threats they couldn't understand." She moved closer to Kyle, and as she did, every creature in the hall turned to track her movement, their loyalty and devotion as visible as banners carried into battle. "You ask whether supernatural forces should dictate political decisions," she continued, her grey eyes beginning to glow with inner light. "But you have forgotten that politics are only possible because supernatural forces chose to protect rather than destroy. Every law you write, every treaty you negotiate, every decision you make is built on the foundation of covenants that require renewal, respect, and recognition." Kyle reached for her hand, and the moment their fingers touched, golden light flared between them, visible to every person in the hall. The mate bond snapped into place with the sound of a key turning in a lock, complete and unbreakable and absolutely right. I, Kyle of House Northwind, Alpha King of the Northern Realm, claim Lyanna of the Beast Queen bloodline as my true mate, he declared, his voice carrying the formal cadence of ancient ritual. I renounce all other bonds, all political arrangements that would deny this truth, all obligations that would ask me to betray the supernatural law that governs my very nature. The creature's response was immediate and overwhelming. Warwolves threw back their heads and howled in celebration, their voices joined by shadow cats whose purring created a harmony that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the hall. The great eagles outside the windows added their piercing cries to the chorus, and even the smallest creatures, the messenger hawks and hunting hounds, contributed their voices to the symphony of approval. But it was the ancient bear spirit whose mental voice carried the most weight, reaching every consciousness present with the authority of one who had witnessed the founding of kingdoms. Let it be witnessed by all present that the mate bond is claimed and acknowledged. Let it be recorded that the Beast Queen and the Alpha King have chosen each other not through political necessity, but through the recognition of souls that were meant to be joined. Let the old covenants be renewed through this union, and let the realm prosper under their combined rule. Seraphina's face had gone white with fury, but it was clear that she recognized the finality of what was happening. The supernatural recognition that surrounded the ceremony made it impossible to dismiss as mere political theatre. Even her most dedicated supporters were looking uncertain, aware that they were witnessing something that transcended human authority. "This is not over," she said, her voice carrying the promise of future conflict. "You may have the support of beasts and ancient spirits, but you still rule over human subjects, and humans have long memories when it comes to betrayal." "The only betrayal here," Lyanna replied, her voice carrying the quiet strength of someone who no longer doubted her own worth, "was committed by those who tried to deny what was meant to be. But you are right about one thing, Seraphina. This is not over. The real work is just beginning." Kyle lifted their joined hands, and the golden light that surrounded them grew brighter, warmer, until it seemed to fill the entire hall with the promise of new beginnings. "I present to you Lyanna, Beast Queen of the Northern Realm, my chosen mate and your future queen," he declared. "She brings with her the renewal of ancient alliances, the protection of supernatural powers, and the promise that this kingdom will never again stand alone against the forces that threaten all we hold dear." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything in recorded history. Instead of a formal religious service presided over by human clergy, the mating was witnessed by creatures whose authority predated any human institution. The vows they spoke were simple but profound, promising not just love, but partnership in protecting all who needed protection. When it was finished, when the golden light had settled into a warm glow that would forever mark them as bonded mates, Lyanna looked out over the assembled crowd with eyes that reflected the wisdom of ancient bloodlines and the determination of someone who had found her true purpose. The kingdom had a new queen, the beasts had their chosen leader, the old covenants were renewed, and somewhere in the crowd, Seraphina was already planning her next move, her hatred burning bright enough to illuminate the darkness of whatever schemes she would devise in the days ahead. But for this moment, in this hall, filled with the voices of creatures celebrating the return of their queen, love had triumphed over politics, truth had overcome deception, and the future spread before them like a golden road leading toward possibilities none of them could yet imagine. The attack came at midnight, when the moon was dark and the shadows deepest. Lyanna woke to the sound of chanting, words in a language so old and twisted that they seemed to pollute the very air around them. The mate bond flared with alarm as Kyle stirred beside her, his alpha instincts immediately recognizing the supernatural threat that was building around them. Dark magic, he breathed, his hand reaching for the sword he always kept within arm's reach. Someone is trying to sever your connection to the creatures. The ancient bear spirit's mental voice crashed into their minds with the force of a thunderclap, carrying urgency and something that might have been fear. She has allied herself with the Shadow Weaver's little queen, the forbidden practitioners who trade in blood and broken souls. They seek to cut the threads that bind you to your pack. Outside their chambers, the compound had erupted into chaos. Leanna could hear the creatures responding to the magical assault, their roars and howls of pain cutting through the night as the dark spells tried to tear away the telepathic bonds that connected them to their queen. The shadow cats were screaming, a sound like crystal breaking that made her heart clench with sympathetic agony. She was on her feet before she realized she was moving, her wolf clawing its way to the surface as it felt its pack family under attack. The bedroom door exploded outward under the force of her supernatural strength, and she ran through the corridors of the palace with Kale at her side, following the source of the dark magic to its origin. They found Seraphina in the great courtyard, surrounded by a circle of robed figures whose faces were hidden beneath hoods that seemed to absorb light itself. She stood at the centre of an elaborate ritual circle, drawn in what looked horribly like blood, her hands raised as she directed the flow of corrupted power that was radiating outward like poison. But the spell was not working as intended. Instead of severing Leanna's connection to the creatures, the dark magic was amplifying it, feeding power back through the bonds until she felt as if she were connected to every supernatural being within 100 miles. The Shadow Weavers had underestimated what they were trying to destroy, had failed to understand that the Beast Queen's authority was not something that could be simply cut away. "You fool!" The ancient bear spirit's voice rumbled as he emerged from the palace, his massive form radiating fury. "You seek to sever bonds that predate your bloodline by 1,000 years. You attempt to destroy connections that are written into the very fabric of this realm." Seraphina's face was twisted with desperation and hatred, her perfect beauty marred by the corruption of the magic she was channeling. "She's gathering power, old one. Can't you see what she's becoming? She's calling creatures from across the realm to serve her will. How long before she decides that humans are expendable?" "The only person here who has proven expendable," Leanna said, stepping into the courtyard with her wolf blazing behind her eyes, "is you, Seraphina. You chose to ally with practitioners of the forbidden arts. You chose to traffic in blood magic and soul corruption. You chose to become exactly the kind of threat the Beast Queens were created to stop." The robed figures turned toward her with movements that seemed wrong, too fluid, as if their bodies were no longer entirely their own. When they spoke, their voices carried the hollow echo of beings who had traded away pieces of their humanity for power. "The bloodline ends tonight," they intoned in unison. "The old covenants are broken. The balance is restored." But they had made a critical miscalculation. The dark magic they were wielding was designed to work against normal supernatural bonds, the kind of connections that could be severed or suppressed. What they faced in Leanna was something entirely different, something that existed not just in the realm of magic, but in the fundamental structure of reality itself. The Beast Queen bloodline was not just about commanding creatures. It was about being the living embodiment of the covenant between human and beast, the bridge between worlds that could not be destroyed without destroying the balance that held everything together. As the Shadow Weavers poured more power into their spell, as they tried to force the severance through sheer magical brutality, the ritual began to collapse in on itself. The blood circle started to smoke and bubble. The air around them grew thick with the stench of corruption turning back on itself. And Leanna's power exploded outward with the force of a dam bursting. Every creature within miles felt it, the sudden surge of connection that burned away the dark magic like sunlight destroying shadows. Werewolves that had been writhing in magical agony suddenly found themselves stronger than ever. their loyalty to their queen blazing bright and unbreakable. Shadow cats, whose screams had been tearing at the night, fell silent as their pain vanished, replaced by a fierce joy that pulsed through the telepathic bonds. But it was the Shadow Weavers themselves who bore the brunt of the magical backlash. The power they had been trying to corrupt and control turned against them with devastating efficiency. Their robes caught fire with flames that burned cold and silver, consuming the darkness they had wrapped around themselves like armour. They screamed as the magic they had stolen was torn away from them, leaving them exposed and powerless in the face of forces they had never truly understood. Seraphina staggered backward as her allies fell, her face pale with shock as she realised the magnitude of her failure. The ritual circle was collapsing, the blood that had powered it turning to ash, the carefully crafted spells she had paid so dearly for crumbling like sand. "This is impossible," she whispered, staring at Lyanna with something that might have been terror. "The Shadow Weavers said your bonds could be severed. They said the bloodline could be ended." "The Shadow Weavers," Lyanna replied, her voice carrying the authority of one who had just proven her power beyond any doubt, understood less about the Beast Queen heritage than they claimed. They saw only the surface, the visible connections. They never comprehended that what I am is not something that can be taken away. She gestured to the fallen practitioners, their robes still smouldering with the cold fire that had consumed their stolen power. They trafficked in corruption and called it strength. They broke sacred laws and thought themselves above consequence. They allied with you because they believed you shared their hunger for power at any cost. The ancient bear spirit padded closer to Seraphina, his brown eyes reflecting not anger, but a sadness that spanned centuries. "You had every advantage, Lady Seraphina. Noble birth, political connections, beauty, intelligence. But you chose to see those gifts as weapons to be used against others rather than tools for building something better." Around the courtyard, the creatures that served Lyanna were gathering, not in attack formation, but in the kind of loose circle that spoke of witnesses to judgment rather than executioners preparing for battle. They had felt the dark magic tear at their connections to their queen, and they had felt those same connections become stronger than ever when the spell failed. Their loyalty was no longer just emotional, it was metaphysical, written into the very laws that governed their realm. "The Shadow Weavers are dead," Kyle observed, his voice carrying the clinical assessment of a warrior studying a battlefield. Their magic consumed them when it turned back on itself. As for their allies, he looked at the handful of nobles who had supported Seraphina's conspiracy, men and women who were now staring at the smoking remains of the ritual circle with expressions of absolute terror. "Exile," Lyanna said simply. "Let them carry word to other realms about what happens to those who traffic in the forbidden arts. Let them serve as a warning about the price of standing against the renewed covenants." But Seraphina herself presented a more complex problem. She had orchestrated attempted murder, conspired with practitioners of dark magic, and tried to destroy the very foundations of the kingdom's supernatural protections. By any measure, her crimes warranted the death penalty. Yet, as Lyanna looked at her former rival, she felt not hatred, but pity. Seraphina had been beautiful, intelligent, politically astute. She could have been a valuable ally, a trusted advisor, someone whose skills complemented rather than competed with Lyanna's own abilities. Instead, she had chosen to see the world as a zero-sum game where one person's rise required another's fall. "You will leave this kingdom before sunrise," Lyanna said finally. "You will take nothing but the clothes you wear and whatever money you can carry. You will never return, never contact anyone here, never attempt to interfere with the lives of those you tried to destroy." Seraphina's blue eyes blazed with defiant hatred. "You think exile is mercy? You think sending me away with nothing is kindness?" "I think," Lyanna replied quietly, "that allowing you to live when you allied with those who would have seen me dead is more grace than you deserve. but I will not begin my reign by becoming the monster you tried so hard to paint me as." The ancient bear spirit's mental voice carried approval and something that might have been relief. "Wisdom, little queen. True strength is knowing when violence is necessary and when mercy serves better. You have proven today that the Beast Queen bloodline carries not just power, but the judgment to use it wisely." As dawn broke over the kingdom, as the servants swept away the ashes of the failed ritual and the guards escorted the conspirators to the borders, Lyanna stood in the courtyard surrounded by her chosen family and felt the profound satisfaction of having faced her greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. Seraphina was gone. The Shadow Weavers were destroyed. The dark magic that had threatened to tear apart the ancient covenants had been turned back on itself and consumed. But more importantly, she had proven to herself and to everyone who served her that the Beast Queen could be trusted with the power she carried, that she would choose justice over vengeance, mercy over brutality, wisdom over the easy satisfaction of crushing her enemies. The real challenges of ruling still lay ahead, but she would face them with the absolute certainty that she was exactly who she was meant to be.